Reynders. I hope I didn't butcher that. Who's going to be talking about volatility and variability.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity for this talk. I will be talking about the cognitive mechanisms of strategic variable behavior across different environments. So first of all, why variable behavior? So behaving in a variable way can be a beneficial strategy in many situations. For humans, this mainly applies to certain games or sports where you know that you have to be unpredictable. So for example, when you have to kick multiple penalties in a row, you most likely want to do this in an unpredictable way, such that your opponent cannot see what you're doing, like this soccer player is doing right now, and he scores a goal. But also non-human animals engage in very strategical variable behavior. For example, when being chased by a predator, prey animals show really random-like movements, probably to confuse the predator. And this might mean the difference between life and death for them. But we don't really know how such behavior emerges, and that's a bit the question that we're trying to answer in my project. So this is the outline of my talk. I just start with some introduction. So first of all, how would we study this strategical variability in a more controlled or experimental way? So we do this by giving people or participants a choice context where they have to make choices multiple times in a row. So for example, pick a number between 1 and 8 for 100 times. So eventually participants generate some sort of sequence. And then, of course, we will reward them for some of the choices they make. And the underlying rewarding structure is what we call an adversarial environment. And the way this works is that we will reward participants if their choice, which is followed by the previous one choice, constituting a response pair in the sequence. If this response pair is among the previously least frequent and least recent choice pairs in the entire history of this participant, then they get a reward. And a reward structure like this has already been shown to effectively increase strategical variable decision-making in participants, not only human participants, but also in pigeons and in rats. And we call such an environment adversarial because it's really lets participants break from previous choice patterns that they already made. And this has already been used before, mainly by this one researcher called Alan Neuringer, of whom I'm showing the picture right here, because he did a very interesting line of research. And as I will show you, this adversarial environment is a very rich type of environment to study behavior in a very unpredictable setting. But this kind of learning has never been compared to the more classical stable and volatile reinforcement learning environments, where in a stable environment, reward structure remains constant across all trials, and in a volatile environment, the reward structures only changes every couple of trials. So these types of learnings have never really been compared to each other until now, because that's what we have done. So we will compare these types of learnings with the underlying idea that there's an increasing need for strategical variable choice making across these environments. So then ultimately we can translate our question of how to behave variable to a question of what happens when we move from a stable environment to an environment where we have to be more strategically variable. And now, more concretely, we actually extracted 3 potential underlying mechanisms to behave strategically variable from the literature. So the first one assumes that we have some kind of stochastic generator in our brain that would allow us to make pseudo-random choices. So this would mean that we could somehow block out all past information that we already have about options, and then at each instance just choose randomly. So this would be like throwing dice, where each action is independent from the previous one. Then a second mechanism is that there would be some very fast and dynamic interplay between reinforcement learning and extinction learning happening. So here you would just very quickly learn based from the feedback that you got. And a third potential mechanism is based on memory. So in this case, it's like if you know that you have to be variable, you would try and remember what you already did in the past and then choose to not do that again. So this would really require monitoring of previous actions and monitoring their frequencies and then inhibiting frequent actions. And so these are the mechanisms that we considered, and we will measure the influence of each of these with a simple model that's based on a Wagner model. So I'm sure you've already heard a lot about the Wagner model the past few days, but I will nonetheless explain it again, because in our case, it consists of 3 equations. So we would assume that participants learn to associate values to each of the options in an environment and then make their decision according to these values. And the first equation here is the decision-making policy based on epsilon greedy. So this assumes that the model, this means that the model will take the action with the currently highest Q value with a probability of 1 minus epsilon, and it will take a random action with a probability of epsilon. Then the second equation in red is the Wagner update rule for chosen actions. So here the Q values of a chosen action is learned with a prediction error weighted by a learning rate. And then this last equation adds this lambda parameter to all the Q values of all unchosen actions. So here, lambda would basically serve as an unchosen value bias, and this entire equation serves as a frequency measure for how often or how long an option remains unchosen, because the longer an option remains unchosen, the more lambda is added. So it's basically some kind of frequency measure. And this equation can then do 2 things. So if lambda is positive, it can upvalue unchosen actions, which would be beneficial when you need to be variable, because it makes unchosen actions more likely to be chosen again. And if it's negative, it can devalue unchosen actions. So this model is then, it's governed by 3 parameters that are highlighted in the colors here. And we believe that strategic variability can already be achieved by tweaking one of these 3 parameters. And that's what we first tried to study with a simulation study. So we simulated the model across these 3 environments, the stable, volatile, and adversarial environments. And we used a policy gradient algorithm to see if the model can maximize rewards by meta-learning one of these 3 parameters. And these are the results for epsilon. So as you can see, epsilon or stochasticity should ideally be increased in an adversarial environment compared to stable and volatile ones. And the same is actually true for learning rates. And the same is also true for the unchosen value bias or lambda. And these increases in parameters are also always accompanied by an increase in variability measure, where we measure variability with an entropy score, which is based on Shannon entropy, where a value close to 1 means more variability and a value close to 0 means more repetition. So what this means is that strategical variable behavior or decision-making can be achieved by upregulating any of these 3 parameters, where we assume that upregulating epsilon or stochasticity would be consistent with a stochastic generator mechanism. Upregulating learning rate would be consistent with a reinforcement learning and extinction learning mechanism. And upregulating the unchosen value bias would be consistent with a frequency-based memory. So now we wanted to see which of these parameters do humans and non-human animals upregulate in an adversarial environment. And for that, we needed some data. And luckily, we were allowed to reanalyze some already existing data sets, one on humans, one on pigeons, and one on rats. And these earlier studies, as I already told you, they showed an effective increase in variable decision-making across these species, but they didn't assume any interspecies differences. So what we did is we fitted our Wagner model on these data sets and then looked at the parameter estimates. So that's what you can see here. And now as a side note, each of these subjects, so every dot here represents one subject, and each of these subjects, they did thousands and thousands of trials within an adversarial environment. So even though these epsilon values are quite high, it still left enough trials to also accurately estimate learning rates and the unchosen value bias. And the most interesting thing we see here is for the estimates of the unchosen value bias, because we see only positively valued values for humans and negative ones for pigeons and rats. So this led us to conclude that only in humans, we see that they upvalue the unchosen actions more in an adversarial environment, and they might use some memory components in order to behave variable, and pigeons and rats don't seem to do so. But we wanted to take this further because we still wanted to compare this adversarial learning to more stable and volatile learning. So for that, we designed a new experiment where we exposed human participants to these three environments to then see if human participants can also upregulate one or more of these parameters across these environments. And we transformed this into a game of hide and seek. So participants would see a garden with multiple hiding spots, and they have to search for different animals that are hiding in a blockwise manner, where these animals have different hiding strategies. So one of the animals is a stable hider, meaning this animal always hides behind the same hiding spots with a certain probability. Then one animal is volatile hider, so it also always hides behind the same hiding spots with a certain probability, but this can shuffle every 15 trials. And then one animal was an adversarial hider. So here you really had to break from your past choice patterns for the hiding spots. And we did already 3 experiments with this paradigm, where the third experiment only had 4 hiding spots, and the first 2 experiments had 8 hiding spots. And then participants, they got positive feedback by finding the animal and seeing it appear before this hiding spot that they clicked. And they saw negative feedback if they didn't find the animal in the hiding spot that they clicked. Then as a manipulation check, we first checked if variability indeed increased across these 3 environments, which was luckily the case for most participants, according to this entropy score again. And then we fitted our model to this data, but we actually fitted 8 different versions of the model where different sets of the parameters are allowed to vary between these environments. So on the x-axis here, you can see the 8 models, which are indicated by which parameters that were allowed to vary, while the other parameters remained fixed. And then on the y-axis, you will see the amount of participants, which had this model as the best model fit. So these are the results for the first 2 experiments. And here we see that a model that's varying both stochasticity or epsilon and the unchosen value bias seems to win for most participants. And in general, it's almost always at least a model that varies stochasticity that seems to win for most participants. Then for the third experiment, it's actually the full model that seems to win for most participants. But again, it's almost always a model that varies at least stochasticity between environments that wins most often. And then we looked at how these parameters varied between environments. So for this, we looked at the parameter estimates for the full model. And these are the results. So here again, every dot is 1 participant, and the star indicates the average. And as you can see, there's a lot of individual differences, but the parameters also meaningfully differ between environments. But if we zoom in more, we can see that epsilon or stochasticity is only in an adversarial environment statistically different. Then learning rate is only in a stable environment statistically different, and the unchosen value bias is again in an adversarial environment statistically different. So what this means is that if we were to compare stable to volatile learning, then it seems to be sufficient for human participants to only upregulate the learning rates, as also already a lot of other reinforcement learning literature has already shown. So this only requires a little bit of increase in variability. But if we were then to compare this with behavior in an adversarial environment, where way more strategical variable decision making is necessary, then it's also beneficial for human participants to also increase the stochasticity and the unchosen value bias. So it really depends on which environmental shift you experience, which kind of strategies that you use to be variable or to adapt your variability. So to conclude, we asked the question of how to behave variable. And I showed you 3 potential mechanisms to do so and a model that can measure the influence of each of these. Then I showed you some interspecies differences in the variability strategies that species use in adversarial environments. And then lastly, I showed you this new paradigm that we developed to measure strategical variable decision-making across different environments. And with that, I would like to thank my 2 labs and specifically my 2 supervisors, Sabine Braam and Tom Vergits. If you like to know more about this, you can visit me at my poster, which is number 7, or you can scan our preprints. And if you would like to try to play against an adversarial animal yourself, you can scan the above QR codes. But I have to warn you that this only works on a laptop, so you would have to scan it and then copy paste the link on a laptop. And there you can then also play some other fun gamified experiments from our lab. Thank you for listening.